For Australia, the Second World War extended from September 1939 to September 1945. 6 long years, or a very trying 72 months. In this period of time, not all months were created equal. In the first month, Australians were committed to war in the now familiar announcement by the then Prime Minister, Robert Menzies.
Fellow Australians, it is my melancholy duty to inform you officially that in consequence of a persistence by Germany in her invasion of Poland, Great Britain has declared war upon her, and that as a result, Australia is also at war.
The initial cause of the war was Germany's invasion of Poland, but by the start of the second month, the Poles were defeated, and suddenly, for all practical purposes, nothing happened. Germany's subjugation of Poland created an enormous challenge for Britain and her empire. Germany possessed more than 100 army divisions representing more than 3 million men under arms. Britain could not even field 20 divisions at the start of the war. Even if it could get them into Europe, Britain was in no position to fight a war in the centre of Europe. Berlin lies 1,000 kilometres from London, and Warsaw, the capital of Poland, 1,500 kilometres away. Further months passed, and the nothing that continued to happen was dubbed the Phony War, or the Sitzkrieg, a period of some 7 months from September 1939 to April 1940, when no major fighting took place. But even as Germany invaded France in April 1940 and attacked Britain by air from July 1940, the effect on ordinary Australians was not great. Australians were, of course, not doing absolutely nothing. They were enlisting in the forces and training for the battles to come. Industry was also being geared up to provide the aircraft, ships and guns that Australians sorely lacked. Some Australians used their own initiative and joined the Royal Air Force directly and fought in the Battle of Britain, such as Pat Hughes from Cooma, who became an air ace downing 14 German planes. But the numbers of Australians directly involved in the defence of Britain were small. Larger numbers of Australians would serve in Bomber Command in the United Kingdom, but in 1940 the training scheme for Australian aircrew was just being established. By the 13th month of the war, the Battle of Britain had run its course. Unlike World War I, there would be no commitment of Australians to fight in Europe. The fight would have to be undertaken on the fringes. Air Force personnel would be provided in large numbers to Britain under a scheme known as the Empire Training Scheme. The Australian Navy deployed to the Mediterranean, where it skirmished with the Italian Navy and had some successes, such as HMAS Sydney's part in the sinking of an Italian cruiser at Cape Sparta. It was not until the 15th month of the war that Australians were involved in a major land battle. In early 1941, Australians participated in the Battle for Bardia on the Libyan coast. Some 130 Australians were killed and more than 300 wounded, but 40,000 Italian troops capitulated and were taken prisoner. It was a major victory. Although the war in North Africa and the Mediterranean would heat up during 1941, nothing in the first 24 months of World War II would prepare Australia for the first 9 months of war with Japan. In 9 short months, Australians fought and lost more than 9 significant land and sea battles. 3,000 servicemen lost their lives and almost 500 civilians were killed. Over 20,000 Australians would become prisoners of war, of whom 8,000 would never return home. Beginning with Darwin, Australian cities were bombed and shelled and Australian shipping was sunk by Japanese submarines. In the 45 months in which Australia was to fight Japan, these first 9 months saw a combat death rate almost double that seen in the rest of the war. When the deaths of Australians taken as prisoners is considered, these first 9 months account for more than 30% of all Australians killed in the 72 months of World War II. By September 1942, Japan had annexed 14 countries or major islands, which in many cases were colonies of European powers. They had subjugated 130 million people into what Japan called its Greater East Asian Co-Prosperity Sphere. Of course, not all citizens of the Co-Prosperity Sphere were equally welcome. Some 50,000 civilians died in New Guinea and the Pacific Islands, and an estimated 100,000 civilians died in Malaya and Singapore. In what is now Indonesia, estimates of civilian deaths vary from 500,000 to 1.5 million. So in warfare, not all months are created equal. The impact of the months between December 1941 and September 1942 was to shake Australia to its very core. The author of the book, 1942, Australia's Greatest Peril, Bob Worth, documents just how badly the cascading disasters affected Australians politically and socially. One supplicant writing to the Prime Minister in early 1942 was to write, "There is much unhappiness amongst people of different groups in our society because of belief, which some say is based on fact, that numbers of our leading business and financial folk would sell out to Japan and make peace in the hope of preserving their business and profits. Associated with this is the statement which is made by some of these folk that we just cannot prevent Japan landing if it wants to, and therefore we should not waste blood and money over it, but come to terms." These views, by an academic, eerily echo the views of a Labour Party pamphlet issued some 2 years later for the 1943 general election. A view from the left side of politics that the right was defeatist. Conversely, one well-known journalist, Joe Alexander, thought that Labour ministers at the time, H.V. Evatt and Jack Beazley, wanted to make peace with Japan. The same journalist claimed, from a meeting with Prime Minister Curtin, that Curtin was depressed because he had heard that a number of people in Sydney were preparing to make peace to save Sydney. Alexander went on to write, "Sydney, the incredibly selfish, callous, pleasure-loving, without faith in God or man, is semi-defeated and might want to save itself as Paris was saved. It may want to be declared an open town. Unless we are psychologically reborn with the first shock of attack, we are doomed." Of course, offended Sydney-siders can take comfort in the fact that Joe Alexander worked for the Melbourne Herald newspaper and may have been a bit partisan. However, Sydney-siders' fears were reflected in the housing market, where prices in Sydney's seaside and eastern suburbs plummeted and those in the more distant Blue Mountains actually rose. One academic has recorded Townsville's reaction to the outbreak of war with Japan. He noted that the initial reaction of his citizens to the outbreak bordered very close to panic. Blackout regulations were enforced and all radio stations from Townsville's north ordered off the air after sunset. After the fall of Lae in March 1942, schools were closed down. A hurried exodus to the south began, and by the middle of 1942, Townsville had lost nearly 1/4 of her population, some 5,000 to 7,000 souls. People were scared stiff. You couldn't book a plane flight, not that there were many planes flying. You couldn't even make a trunk line telephone call without getting the permission of the military authorities. People just flocked away. They couldn't get on trains out of Townsville quick enough. They leased their homes for long periods if they could find anyone to walk in and take a lease, or they just walked out and left their homes empty. Some simply gave their homes away. American observers were also worried about Australia. US Brigadier General Clark, serving in Australia at the time, summed up his views to a colleague. The weaknesses of the Australian people and their government, faced with Japanese invasion, appear to be, first, a deep-rooted complacency and a feeling it can't happen here. Second, a lack of realism and a tendency to avoid unpleasant issues. Third, some tendency to panic when suddenly faced with reality. The fears faced by Australians were reflected in the military assessments of the time. While military opinion was divided on a Japanese invasion of Australia, the prospect that the Japanese would seize Darwin and possibly Fremantle and Perth was seen as quite probable, not just by the Australians, but also by military within the United Kingdom and America. It was thought that the Japanese might seize Darwin with 1 or 2 army divisions. In early 1942, Australia notionally could field 7 militia divisions, but these divisions were, on average, 30% below strength. All were under-equipped to some extent. For example, in late 1941, most had, on average, only 50% of their required motor transport, and even the basic supply of rifles was running 30% below demand. As late as mid-1942, a unit training assessment of 31 Army combat units rated only 4 as having met the top training standard of A grade. None of the remaining units had met the second highest training rating of B grade. Only 8 had met the C grade training rating. Given the state of the forces available for the defence of Australia, there really did seem little prospect of being able to defend more than the industrial and population heartland between Newcastle and Wollongong, with Melbourne and Brisbane being seen as protective flanks. The naval situation was arguably worse, with Australia's small force of cruisers and destroyers returned home but tired after long service in the Mediterranean and needing refits and refurbishment. By mid-1942, according to Dr. Andrew Ross in his book Armed and Ready, the RAAF could probably have fielded over 100 fighters for the defence of Australia, but the Japanese could have doubled this number and arguably had more experienced and battle-tested pilots. They would also have had the advantage of concentrating their fighter and bomber forces for attack, whereas the RAAF could not completely concentrate its aircraft in one area without leaving other key areas exposed. With these prospects, the federal government wrote secretly to the state government on plans for demolition of infrastructure, such as airfields, power stations and bridges, before they fell to the Japanese. Australia would have to defend what it could, and it would destroy what it couldn't. Australians came to such a desperate crossroad because of 9 months of almost continuous battlefield defeats. What was happening such that time and time again Australians were losing? Our connections with this period are emotional connections rather than a studied understanding of what happened, when and why. The fall of Singapore is rightly remembered with sadness for the many that would suffer and die as prisoners of war. The battle for Kokoda remembered with gratitude and pride in the fortitude, tenacity and personal self-sacrifice of the soldiers. But getting beyond a heartfelt but vague connection to a better understanding is not easy. So much happened in a short space of time. Quickly finding out who did what to whom, when and where is beyond the resources and patience of most of us. The official histories are a great source of information, but require a serious commitment in time to read and are compartmented on service lines. A chapter of the official histories will make clear what the Army was doing at a point in time and at a given location, but not necessarily what the RAN or the RAAF was doing. This can be addressed by searching separate chapters in different volumes, but there is not always alignment between volumes and chapters. Gavin Long's The 6-Year War is a more condensed work and looks at the three services more or less simultaneously. It is a great book on Australia in World War II. However, for time-poor, busy Australians with an interest in military history, There is not a great deal in terms of easily accessible and digestible video documentaries. There is a gap between the dense and well-documented written record and video documentaries that would facilitate understanding of these critical events in Australian history. This is a shame. As defence gurus in Australia and the United States ominously discuss what to do about the rise of China as the next dominant Pacific power, it might pay to better understand how Australia handled the rise of a previous Pacific power. This video is a small attempt to rectify this gap.